Hello and welcome to today's King's India Institute seminar. My name is Louise Tillin and I am the Director of the King's India Institute at King's College London. Today we are convening to discuss what is a landmark survey on religion in India conducted by the Pew Research Center. Between late 2019 and spring 2020, Pew surveyed almost 30,000 adults across India to examine the role of religion in public life. The findings shed remarkable light on religious beliefs and practice, on the boundaries and bridges between religious communities, the articulation of the Indian nation, and the relations between the social and political lives of religion. To help us dive into the report's findings and discuss their implications, we are joined today by Dr. Neha Sahgal, Associate Director of Research at Pew Research Center, and a distinguished panel. Neha Sahgal specializes in international polling on religion, and she is an author of studies on the religious beliefs and practices of religious communities across the world. She's worked on Christian-Muslim relations in sub-Saharan Africa, on religion in Latin America, religious divisions in Israel, religion and national identity in Central and Eastern Europe, the role of religion in Western Europe, and most recently, of course, has been at the helm of this survey of religion in India. We are also joined by three discussants to help us make sense of the data. Professor Hilal Ahmed is Associate Professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi. Hilal works on political Islam, Muslim politics of representation, and the politics of symbols in South Asia. And his book, Muslim Political Discourse in Post-Colonial India, Monuments, Memory, Contestation, was published by Routledge in 2014. Professor Ravinder Kaur is a professor of sociology and social anthropology at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. And she's previously taught at the University of Delhi and at New York University. And she's joining us today from Washington, DC, like Neha. So we're very glad that they're able to join us despite the rather early hour on the East Coast. Ravinder's current research interests are in the areas of the sociology of gender, family, marriage, kinship, middle classes, and technology. And lastly, we're joined as a discussant by Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, who is Avantha Chair and Professor of Indian Politics and Sociology at the King's India Institute. He also teaches South Asian politics and history at Sciences Po in Paris and is an overseas fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I should just note perhaps that Hilal and Ravinder both served as advisors on the survey for Pew, so they have been deeply involved. We will begin today's session with an overview of the main survey findings, which Neha will give us. And then I will invite each of our discussants to offer some preliminary reflections for 5 to 10 minutes before opening out to a question and answer session. We're hoping to keep the main discussion today reasonably tight and to conclude the presentations within 60 minutes. And we'll be recording that first 60 minutes. But we also anticipate that given the richness of the data and the many questions that it throws up, that we may continue the discussion for up to half an hour longer for those who can stay, and that's purely optional. Of course, as ever with these Zoom webinars, if you have a question during the presentations, please feel free to type it in the Q&A box, and then I will pose those to the panel when we get to that point in proceedings. So over to you, Neha.
Thank you, Louise, for this kind introduction, and thank you for hosting the Pew Research Center today. Let me go ahead and enter full screen mode. There we are. It is my honor to represent Pew Research Center today to present the results of the Religion in India survey. This is the single largest ever survey outside the United States that we have done in one country. And it's an honor to talk about some of the results. I should mention my fabulous team has worked with me on this, but I just have the honor of being here in front of you, presenting all of this. Quick word about the Pew Research Center. We are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. We call ourselves a fact tank. Our job is to present data about issues that shape our world, but not to take a position. on any of that data or any of those issues. We simply provide the data to the public debate. Our primary funder is the Pew Charitable Trust, but for this study, as well as a lot of our other work on religion, we also receive funds from the John Templeton Foundation, but we do not have any commercial interests, and we are nonprofit. And with that, let's talk about the Religion in India survey. This is the result of 30,000 interviews conducted nationally with population 18 plus. We were not able to do a survey in the Kashmir Valley, and that's because of the lockdown in Kashmir that occurred much earlier than we went in the field. And because of the rapidly developing COVID situation in India, this was the first wave of COVID, we were not able to do the survey in two northeastern states, Sikkim and Manipur. So this field period was November 2019 to March 2020. So you can see we just got out right before the country went into lockdown. Interviews were conducted in 17 different languages, including English, and the interviews lasted about 45 minutes on average. So there's a lot in this study that I won't be able to highlight today in the interest of time, but I do encourage you to go to our website and take a look at the aspects of the survey that might interest you or that might pique your interest. Because of the large sample size of this survey, we are able to talk about the 6 major religious groups, not only Hindus, but also smaller groups like Sikhs, Buddhists, as well as Jains. It is important to remember that groups like Parsis, Jews, etc., are included in the survey, but we just don't have enough interviews with these groups to be able to separately talk about their opinions. So what's going on with religion in India? We find in the data that 2 things are going on at the same time. On the one hand, Indians express a high level of commitment to the principles of tolerance. At the same time, they also express a keen desire to live religiously segregated lives. And these 2 things are coexistent in India. And we get the sense that Indians' concept of pluralism is to live in a society where people live together, but separately. It's a patchwork quilt model of pluralism, which is in direct contrast to what maybe people elsewhere are more used to or aspire to, and that being more of a melting pot concept of pluralism. Indian pluralism looks more like a thali or a patchwork quilt, as we've said in the report. But while this desire for religious segregation coexists with a commitment to tolerance, religious segregation is also closely tied with some of the fault lines we see in India today when it comes to people's attitudes about nationalism, about national identity, as well as about politics. So what I'm going to do today is unpack each of these 3 elements of what we see in the data, beginning with tolerance, shared values, as well as beliefs. Indians generally see that they live in a religiously free society. We ask people, how free are you to practice your religion? And mostly people say that they are very free. This is not just true of the vast majority of Hindus, but it's also true for other groups like Muslims, Christians, and as well as Buddhists and Jains. Not only do they see a high level of religious freedom, they also see tolerance as a core value. So they say that respecting all religions is very important to being truly Indian. And they also see tolerance as a religious value. So they tell us that respecting other religions is a very important part of what being a Muslim means to them, or what being a Christian means to them. So tolerance is seen as a national value, and it is also seen as a religious value. In addition, we also find that there are some religious beliefs and practices that seemingly cross over theological lines. So one good example is the concept of karma. If we ask people, do you believe in karma? Vast majority of Hindus, 77%, say that they do. But an identical share of Muslims also say that they believe in karma. Now you might say, well, karma is sort of a, Asian belief, and even some Americans believe in karma, so, no big deal. But just to be sure, we've also asked about some other beliefs. So for example, do you believe that the Ganges River has the power to purify? This is a quintessential Hindu belief, and of course, Hindus believe it, but so do roughly 1/4 of Muslims and 1/3 of Christians. So there is this mixing of religious faith, even at the same time, people are living religiously segregated lives. Still, when you ask Indians, how much do you have in common with people of other religions? Generally, the perception is that they are very different from people in other religious groups. So when we ask Hindus, do you have a lot in common with Muslims in India, or are you very different from Muslims in India? Most Hindus say that they are very different from Muslims in India, and most Hindus also say they are very different from Christians, and about half of them say they are very different from Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains. Muslims return this sentiment. About an equal share of Muslims, 64%, say they are very different from the country's Hindus. And generally, Muslims also see themselves as different from other religious groups in India. And this is despite the fact that there may be some theological similarities, at least among some of these groups. So, of course, these are the larger religious communities in India, and they do share a history. But we also find that this is a trend among other religious groups in India. The perception of difference far outweighs the perception of similarity. There are a couple exceptions. For most Jains, they do say that they have a lot in common with Hindus in India, and about half of Sikhs also see commonality with Hindus. But by and large, the people tend to say that they are very different from people in other religious groups. This perception of difference carries over to how people live their daily lives. We find a lot of evidence that Indians are living highly religiously segregated lives. And one way in which we see this in how people feel about interreligious marriage. So overall, people say that it is very important to stop interreligious marriage of both women as well as men. 2/3 of Hindus say that it is very important to stop women in their community from marrying into other religions. About the same say it is very important to stop Hindu men from marrying into other religions. And among Muslims, this sentiment is even more widespread. 80% of Muslims say that Muslim women should be stopped from marrying into other religions. About the same share feeling similarly about the interreligious marriage of Muslim men. But it isn't just about marriage. Right? It isn't just about what kind of marriage is appropriate and what should be stopped. It's also about people's friendship circles. Overwhelmingly, we find that Indians stick to their own when it comes to their friendship circles. They say that either all their close friends share their religion or most of their close friends share their religion. This is true for Hindus. Now, of course, Hindus in the majority community, it makes sense that they may have greater opportunity to interact with other Hindus, but it's also true for a small group like Jains as well as Buddhists, who just form a sliver of the population. Even among them, most people stick to friendship circles that are comprised of people of their same religious group. Most people don't go so far as to say they want to live in religiously segregated neighborhoods. Still, we do find that a significant share of people would rather keep certain other religious groups out of their neighborhood. So, for example, among Hindus, 36% say, or more than a third say, they would not want a Muslim in their neighborhood. And some people wouldn't want a Christian in their neighborhood. Roughly a quarter of Hindus say they wouldn't want a Sikh, a Buddhist, or a Jain in their neighborhood. And that's the same. If you look at the attitudes of Muslims, about the same, about a quarter say they wouldn't want a Christian or a Sikh or a Buddhist or a Jain in their neighborhood. And even when you look at other religious groups, you again see the same pattern. Significant shares would rather keep certain other groups out of the areas where they live. In particular, I'll point to Jains, a majority of whom would not want a Muslim in their village or their neighboring area, and about half would not want a Christian living around them. This segregation, while it may coexist with a commitment to tolerance, is directly correlated with some fault lines when it comes to attitudes toward national identity as well as politics. So, for one, for India's majority Hindu community, being a Hindu and being Indian is intricately tied together. 2/3 of Indian Hindus say being Hindu is very important to being truly Indian. And a slim majority, 59%, also say speaking Hindi is very important to being truly Indian. Now, Hindi is one of dozens of languages spoken in India. This religious as well as linguistic dimension of national identity is closely tied together. Those who say that speaking Hindi is crucial to Indian identity also tend to say that religion is crucial to Indian identity. And about half of Hindus take both positions. They say both being a Hindu and speaking Hindi is crucial to be truly Indian. These attitudes toward national identity are highly political. If you look at BJP, the ruling party in India, if you look at its total vote share in the 2019 parliamentary election, overall, about half of Hindus say they voted for the BJP. But this vote share can vary significantly based on Hindus' views of national identity. So among those who say it is very important to be Hindu, to be truly Indian, a majority say they voted for BJP. Among those who say this is somewhat important, so they see a link, but not as crucial a link, BJP's vote share falls. Among those who don't see a connection between religion and national identity, BJP's vote share falls further still. So you see the close connection between views of national identity and politics. If I showed you this bar chart for how people view the Hindi language, you'd actually see the exact same pattern, which again points to the fact that today in India, at least among Hindus, language, religion, and politics are deeply intertwined. We find that 30% of Hindus take all three positions. They say being a Hindu is very important to being truly Indian. They say the same thing about speaking Hindi, and they voted for the BJP in the last parliamentary election. This 30% of Hindus is a distinct group. Their attitudes are distinct in a number of ways. Their regional distribution varies quite a bit. The way they practice religion varies or differs from other Hindus. But one consistent pattern is their attitudes on segregation. And this brings me back to where we began the story of religion in India and high levels of religious segregation. We find that Hindus who link religion as well as language with national identity, and those who voted for the BJP, prefer a much more religiously segregated life. 46% of them say they would not want a Muslim as a neighbor. They also are more likely to say they wouldn't want a Christian, Sikh, Buddhist, or a Jain as a neighbor. A majority of them say all of their close friends are Hindu. And the feeling that the interreligious marriage of Hindu women must be stopped is more widespread in this community. So overall, this group, this 30% of Hindus, lives a much more religiously segregated life than other Hindus in India. But what about the attitudes of India's minority communities? Well, we asked them, how important is it to be Hindu to be truly Indian? And of course, Hindus stand out, but 27% of Muslims hold this view, and as do some shares, and among Jains it's a higher share, of other minority communities. So let's talk about the attitudes of Muslims in a little more detail. Overall, Muslims in India express great enthusiasm for Indian culture. They agree with the sentiment, Indian people are not perfect, but Indian culture is superior to others. 85% agree with this sentiment, and that includes 63% who completely agree with this sentiment. In addition, on a national level, we find 1 in 5 Muslims saying that they have personally faced religious discrimination in the past 12 months. Most Muslims do not say that they have faced recent religious discrimination, or at least in the last 12 months, but this share varies quite a bit regionally. In the north of the country, which includes Rajasthan, includes the National Capital Territory of Delhi, 40% of Muslims say that they have faced religious discrimination in the last 12 months. And keep in mind that the survey field period does coincide some, although not entirely, with the protests against the citizenship bill. In the Northeast, more than a third of Muslims say that they have faced recent religious discrimination. Overall, though, we don't find the majority of Muslims saying that they are facing religious discrimination. But Muslims do express a strong preference for having access to their own religious courts for family disputes or civil disputes in India today. Of course, they have this access already. They've had it for a long time, and since the pre-independence. Today, 3 in 4 Muslims support this provision for their community. And this is a fault line again, because many fewer among other religious communities support giving Muslims access to their own religious courts for family disputes, as well as inheritance and so on. Perhaps one seminal event in the history of Hindu-Muslim relations in India is the partition of the subcontinent into India and Pakistan. And sometimes we ask these kinds of historical perspective questions in our surveys. So here we ask people, do you think the partition of India and Pakistan was a good thing or a bad thing for Hindu-Muslim relations? Generally, we find that among Muslims, the prevailing view is that the partition was a bad thing for their relationship with the Hindu community. Half of Muslims say this. Many fewer say the partition was a good thing for Hindu-Muslim relations. Among Hindus, though, you see a different pattern. First of all, Hindu public opinion on this question is more divided. But on balance, Hindus lean towards seeing partition as a good thing for Hindu-Muslim relations in the country. Sikhs are the one religious community where a majority of people feel that the partition of the subcontinent was a bad thing for Hindu-Muslim relations. That brings me to the conclusion of my remarks. As I mentioned to you, there's a lot more in this survey. Regional differences in Hindu attitudes, particularly views in the South compared with the rest of the country, caste and religious conversion, Sikh identity and religious observance, and so on. For this and more, I'd encourage you to go to pewresearch.org/India survey. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you ever so much, Neha, for that whirlwind tour of the headlines from the report. There are questions already coming in, which is great, and I encourage people to continue to post in the Q&A. I'm not going to ask Neha any questions now because I'd like to hear from our panel first, but we will then ask Neha to respond, especially for questions for clarification about what else might have been asked in the survey and so on. So I have seen your questions, although I'm not going to ask them just yet. But for now, I'd like to turn to Hilal first, if I may, to offer some reflections on the report.
Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you, Kings, for doing this event, and particularly to Pew and Neha and her team and Ravinder, because we have been part of this exercise for 2-3 years, and it was wonderful working with them. We learned, personally, I learned a lot while part of this initiative. What I am going to do is to build on what Neha has just presented. And to be precise, I would like to begin with a clarification. Because usually, the way in which we take survey data, the public perception of survey data is that these are answers. But as a person who is deeply involved in survey, I would say that these are not answers, these are basically questions. They would indicate us to a certain direction to do further research. So in that manner, I think there are certain indications and evidences by which we can construct a narrative. So these are basically alphabets, and we have to construct a word. And this is what I'm going to do now. I wrote an article, and in the beginning of when I was reading this report, the first thing that occurred to me was a famous Phir Bhi Dil Hai Hindustani song, a Shah Rukh Khan film, which says, "हम लोगों को समझ सको तो समझो दिलबर जानी, जितना भी तुम समझोगे उतनी होगी हैरानी." The more you understand India, you will be amazed. And this amazing feeling is something which we need to unpack intellectually, and this is the challenge. Again, by understanding the ways in which survey functions, as well as how should we interpret different findings. So these are the preliminary remarks on the report. What I would like to do now is to, as I said, that to construct a word. In my view, the contemporary national identity is something which we must talk about. Because if we think of various ways in which this survey data is taking us to, there are four elements of national identity which can clearly be underlined and which can clearly be understood by putting these different findings together. The first thing is, which I would like to call idea of respect for another religion. It is strongly asserted, I would say, I think more than 94% Indians would say that respect for other religion is a precondition to being called a truly Indian. And this idea of respect is not limited in a political nationalist sense. This is expanded, and in order to associate one's own identity with his or her religious group, idea of respect is coming back very powerfully, that if I as a Muslim respect other religion, only then I would be called a Muslim. So this is again a very important idea which constitute our national identity in a positive way. The second aspect of this respect thing actually goes into the civic element, which very clearly, very clearly lead us to certain symbols like national anthem, like constitution, etc., or respect for army, etc. And we find that overwhelming majority of Indians believe that respecting symbols, including institution and something called constitution, is very important to be identified as a truly Indian. So that's the second aspect. First is respect. Second is the respect for national symbol. And third is knowledge of freedom struggle. Now, this memory of freedom struggle is very powerful, and it reminds us that after 70 odd years, Indians are still very well, they would like to situate their national identity in the larger frame of a historical moment called national movement. And this is a very powerful finding, which will actually lead us to different direction. Because if you look at what is happening in India in the last 10 years, national movement is coming out in a variety of ways, be it India against corruption, or the nationalism of BJP kind. You may find that national movement as a reference point. So it has got a connection with a popular perception in which the past is always invoked to assert present political identities. So this is the third, in my view, third powerful component of India's contemporary political identity. Now the Hindu Hindustan slogan, this is the fourth element. I think we require a historical approach to understand this and what is specific at the contemporary moment. If you closely look at the data and do not look at this data in connection to each other and separate these Hindi, Hindu, and not Hindustan, this time Hindutva, though Hindutva is not mentioned entirely in the report, but we interpret it. So if we just disassociate these three elements, we get very different meanings. For instance, asserting Hindu religiosity is also being interpreted in nationalist term by the political class in recent year. And when I say political class, it does not entirely mean BJP. Look at what Aam Aadmi Part 1 was doing in India when nationalism was invoked. So the increasing religiosity intermingled with national identity, and the assertion it gets is of a similar kind, that to be an Indian, you have to be Hindu. So 64% figure can be interpreted in the contemporary assertion of nationalism, which began in 2011, not 2014. If you look at Hindi, now this is a very fantastic finding, because that was my assumption that we would have very strong sympathy for Hindi, and because we should not reduce Hindi to Hindustan, old slogan of Janasangh or the BJP, because the spread of Hindi is, the career of Hindi is not depend on BJP or Hindutva. Bollywood was something which made it very popular in India before the advent of this version of BJP. Similarly, if you closely look at the social movements, the sphere of social movement, you may find that the language structure is gradually changing. And as a result, at the moment, if you look at all the senior English news channel journalists, they are virtually forced to speak in Hindi and conduct Hindi shows. It shows something that asserting Hindi and linked it to nationalism has got something very specific to do. So that's the second point, if we just unpack Hindi, Hindu, and Hindutva. Now the Hindutva element is also very crucial and important. We must remember that political class, when I say political class, non-BJP political parties, have virtually failed to engage with Hindutva version of BJP. They are competing with BJP in order to show that they are more Hindu or more Hindutva, and to attract, attract Hindu voters. So they have failed and they cannot do that. But if you, and that's their laziness. They are not actually investing themselves to link this Hindu pride with composite nationalism, which is very clearly in the report. My final point is about living together separately. If we just, combine these four elements: respect for religion, respect for symbols, memory of national movement, and Hindutva unpacked, we may get a different version of living together separately. And in this living together separately thing, the focus of the political class is on separately, the term separately. But they are not emphasizing on the aspect called living together. And the beauty of this report is that it is emphasizing the living together aspect more clearly and more assertively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilal. And I now might turn to Ravinder, if I may, to offer some reflections. You're muted still, Ravinder.
So I'd also like to begin by thanking the Pew team for doing such a fantastic report and Neha for leading it. Thanks to Louis for chairing this session. I'm going to talk about some very different things, maybe, or not so different from Hilal in a way. While, reading the report, I noticed something that ran through the report. And this is about, the attitudes of the younger people, which I found were way more relaxed or way more, liberal than those of the older generations. So if you look at, things like attitudes towards intermarriage, friendships, co-residence, knowledge and openness towards other people's religion, not considering Hindi necessary to bring a true Indian, less acceptance of religious beliefs like karma, reincarnation, etc. You take anything, wearing of janeyu, covering of head by women. There are pointers, very strong pointers running through the report that the young are approaching their religious lives. I will say that, they continue to be religious. The numbers show us that, so people are not rejecting religion, but how they're seeing their religious futures. And I've looked at, younger Muslims in, let's say, urban Mumbai, very, very similar kinds of attitudes. The whole negotiation with religion and family, so religion has to be negotiated via family in many ways, because that's where the inheritance of religion comes from, is happening throughout. And I think this is very hopeful. This is very promising in many ways, that this openness is beginning to take place. I would also link it, to the, of course, the so-called demographic dividend, and that we have a younger population. And I would also link it to the rise in education and the spread of education, which has been fabulous in the last couple of decades. I think about more than 35% of young Indians are in colleges, of whom 50% are now women. And if you look at the college as a space of interaction, it's offering people very different kinds of interactions that they might experience in the family, the neighborhood. And my knowledge comes from, looking at like PhD thesis on young Jat women in Ghaziabad and Meerut, etc., or, families in Hyderabad, etc. So you see that, there is this shift. It may be very imperceptible at the moment. It's beginning to happen. And so Indians remain believers, but I think they are going to be less rigid believers. And the future is something that we would like to look towards. Maybe the South, which was it came as quite a surprise to me that the importance of religion had declined, although not the importance of astrology, which I would look forward to exploring at another point of time. But the South shows that, with education, with resistance to caste, and this questioning is going on among the youth all the time. So I don't want to take too much time on my points. So I will go on to the next one. Just the report. Sorry, I dropped my paper. The report, points to the rise of the BJP, which Hilal talks about in a very interesting fashion, and the kind of, intensification of Hindi nationalism. This, as the report shows, is largely a North Central phenomenon of the Hindi heartland, and in fact, not even so much of the North as what the report calls the central states. That is the large states of UP and Madhya Pradesh. And those are very interesting to me for various other reasons, whether it's sun preference, the decline of fertility, all kinds of things. But how do we explain this? So I'm going to take a longer view, not the current view that which we are experiencing, as members of this nation. But how I would link it, to the rise of the middle class and the middle classes. And this turn towards the religiosity of a certain sort, of which emphasizes, greater observance, greater separation, or whatever in some ways. Although I felt that the report does not quite capture everyday interdependencies between different religions. That doesn't come along, and that can only come through ethnography. So going back to the point about the middle class, in India, the middle class, or middle classes as we call them, their numbers have been increasing. And I'm especially focused on something I call the emerging middle class. And this middle class finds a certain type of adoption of certain kinds of religiosity very important to its class mobility strategies. And a lot of castes are participating in this. The OBCs are participating in it. The Dalit castes, which in numbers come out much larger in this report than the Census of India, are participating in it. So it's very important for people to go on pilgrimages. It's very important for people to participate in fasts and feasts. I mean, we also have to keep in mind the commercialization of religion that is happening, and the role of media in all this. But to me, what is really important is this, these are middle class strategies of becoming middle class, this adoption. And maybe, it's the life cycle ceremonies remain important. I'm looking at, something called puberty ceremonies in Odisha, which were family ceremonies, but today they have become like mini marriages. So they're religious, yes, people think of them as caste and religion together. But what I want to also say is that there isn't a neat progression, as with anything in India, towards a more secular or a more liberal attitudes towards caste and religion. On the one hand, I've talked about the fact that the BJP and the kind of discourse it has is pulling us in one direction. On the other hand, I feel that the youth are struggling, negotiating in their daily lives, and that's pulling us in another direction. So there is, something like this that is going on, and that really helps us understand some of the larger long-term trends that we may want to think about, So the last thing that I want to quickly talk about is we all know the role of the family is crucial in transmission of religion and other values. And for me, Hilal talked about respect for other religions. I'm going to talk about respect for elders. This comes out so strongly, and in all my work on the family and intergenerational relationships, and this is comes out all the time. And teaching like hordes of IIT youngsters, this is something again that comes out very strongly. But what I want to link it with is that this respect for elders, and even sticking to marriage in your own community and your caste is part of a respect for one's parents. Abiding by one's religion is part of being respectful to older kin and especially parents. This, of course, strengthens caste and religious endogamy, and the sanction of parents remains very important in marriage choices. We talk about love come arranged marriages, etc. Unless the parent's hand is on your head at the end of it, you may not go ahead with choosing a partner that you might want to choose. So I feel, that, and India changes slowly. I think nobody should expect that, such large changes in culture and people's religious identity and how they live would happen overnight. But I think to some extent, these are, for me at the moment, I will say these are the three things that I would like to talk about. I mean, the report is very rich, and one interesting thing, I don't know how one would read it, is that the experience of discrimination that Muslims say that they face is much lesser in Gujarat and Maharashtra, the home of both Hindutva and Gujarat riots and whatever. So one could say maybe people were not felt free enough to complain about that. But on the other hand, it is a striking number. I think I'll stop there, Louise. Don't want to take too much time, but I'm happy to come back and elaborate on things.
Thank you very much. There's a lot here to ponder on. I'm going to invite Christophe next to offer his reflections.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Neha, for this fabulous report. Many things have been said already, so I will really try to say something different. Of course, I'll have to repeat some of the findings, but hopefully in some different perspective. Well, the first point I'd like to make is that reading this report, you understand why Narendra Modi is Prime Minister of India. That's for the political scientist that I am, the first conclusion. And of course, it has to do with the way Hindus define themselves in today's India. Looking at this report, I was thinking about V.D. Savarkar's book, Who is a Hindu? Hindutva, Who is a Hindu? Well, who is a Hindu today is someone who thinks that to be a Hindu is very important to be a Indian. And that's exactly what the Hindutva school of thought assumes. The true Indians are the Hindus. 64% of the Hindus think that to be a Hindu is very important, to be truly Indian. And this truly word is very important. And as Hilal has, of course, emphasized, 59% of them think that to be able to speak Hindi is equally important to be a Hindu. So this is something that indeed arcs back to the slogan, Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, but that has to be seen with in relation to something nobody has mentioned so far. 51% of the Hindus do not think it is necessary to believe in God to be a Hindu. So you are Hindu because you are speaking Hindi and proud of being a Hindu. The pride element is all pervasive in this report, but you do not need to believe in God to be a Hindu. No, this is exactly what you found in Hindutva. And this is why Hindutva and Zionism are so close. The Hindus are a people. They are not a community of believers. The identity is not rooted in religion, it's rooted in identity and in, you can also say, ancestries. We could go on, but this is a core element of the Hindutva ideology. We are the descendants of the Vedic fathers. That's what we are. And if you believe in God and if you go to temple and if you practice rituals, it's a bonus. but it's not necessary. The other reason why I find in this report another explanation for why Narendra Modi is Prime Minister of India is that something that has not been mentioned so far is the importance of the strong leader for the Hindus. 50% of Hindus consider that the country should rely on a leader with a strong hand to solve the country's problems. Interestingly, only 45% of them think that democracy is able to solve the problems of the country. You do not solve the problems of the country by being democratic anymore, but by having a strong leader. And that is a very important correlation. That goes with another very interesting figure. 64% of the Hindus consider that politicians should have a large or some influence in religious matters. Politics has to be religious, or religiosity or religion have to be politicized. Now, this is exactly what Narendra Modi did when he presided over the laying of the temple's foundation stone in Ayodhya. So this is a clear indication of the growing indifferentiation between religion and politics. This is one step towards theocracy to some extent. So we have also, of course, as a corollary to this new identity, new definition of what it is to be a Hindu, a rejection of the other. So many things have been said already about this idea of living separately. I will not repeat, except one figure. 43% of the Hindus consider that partition was a good thing. No, so much for Akhand Bharat. The idea that we should reconstitute a multicultural, undivided India does not survive this test. We don't want to mix with the others anymore. But more interestingly for me is this idea that you do not go to the sacred sites of the other. Now, there was a time when in India we had something called the Dargah culture, where when it was really a very important thing to go and visit Sufi saints, places, the Dargahs, Ajmer, Dargah Sharif, Nizamuddin, these were places where you found the Christians, Sikh people, they continue to go, and Hindus. Well, Hindus in this report say that only 3% of them have ever prayed in a Sufi place. That's really, for me, the acid test showing that a civilization is disappearing, an Hindustani civilization, if you want. And the Sufi saints were somewhat the symbols of this civilization, because they showed that indeed we had more in common in spirituality. Fourth, a very interesting point regarding the reformist attitude. You know, reforms, social-religious reform has a long tradition in India. If you go back to the 19th century social-religious reform movement, it starts with Brahmo Samaj. So many people have asked for intercaste marriages, interreligious marriages. Those we call the rationalists have also promoted this. Well, what is interesting to see in this report is that to live separately is not to live separately religiously only. Caste plays a very big role. And for each religion, each and every religion, in fact, there is no difference. Even Muslims are more obsessed with endogamy than Hindus, if you go by the report. The Hindu men and the Hindu women are equally eager to stop the members of their community from marrying into another caste, 63 and 64%. So this idea of living in your own silo, so to speak, goes beyond the religious consideration and arcs back to the resilience of caste. And this is exactly what reformists have fought for decades, if not centuries. You may remember Charan Singh telling bureaucrats will never be recruited if they do not promote intercaste marriages. That was the 60s. That was the era of reformism, probably the days of reformism. Not only that, but indeed, what is very interesting is the resilience of astrology. 87% of Hindus say they fix important dates according to auspicious times. Well, you may understand in a better manner that way why Baba Ramdev can sell his stuff on TV, because it's probably the same kind of resilience of traditions that may explain the success of both, popularity of both. Now, what I would like to end with is regional variations. We have not emphasized sufficiently the regional variations. There is a real contrast between the North and the South. Of course, regarding Hindi, of course, for the South, only 27% of the Hindus consider that to be Hindu, you have to speak Hindi. That's, of course, quite understandable. But it's also true of something else, discrimination against Muslims. 24% of Muslims say that there is a lot of discrimination against Muslims in India today, but there are variations. 35% in North India. More than 1/3 of Muslims of North India consider that there are discriminations against them in India today. I'm a bit puzzled by the figures regarding UP and Madhya Pradesh. Maybe the sample for Muslims is so small that when you disaggregate that at the state level, we miss something. But still, there are regional variations, and we have to factor them in. Still, there is one consensus across the country, across the communities, caste, class, and everything. Communal violence is a very big problem for a large majority of Indians. So instead of emphasizing, and I'm very concerned by the risk, the tolerations, and a somewhat sanitized view of the picture that is reflected there, I would like to emphasize this last figure. If communal violence is still the very big problem for 70% of those who are in the South and 75% of those who are in the Northeast, well, it's not only living separately that is there, it's not only to live each of them in their shell, is that when interaction occurs, the interaction is not necessarily the most benevolent one. And I think this is with a sense of gravitas that I'd like to close on this.
Thank you very much, Christophe, and to all our panelists. You have done your job amazingly and brought us to our 60 minutes. So we have kept to our word. So we now invite anyone who would like to stay with us, and I am going to do my best to start to work through some of the questions that have come in to try and draw out some of the themes. I will do my best to do justice to these, but there is a lot of complexity here and a lot of ideas and divergence. So please be mindful of that. I'm going to ask Neha, if I may, just to respond to several questions which have come in, which I think are usefully asking us to talk a bit more about the social and economic cleavages that intersect with religion. So I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about the caste, class, urban, rural divides and how those map on, especially to some of the views around segregation and tolerance.
Yeah, thank you for that question. We do explore caste. It's not explored in a great deal of detail, but it is there in the survey. So in addition to being a society that is segregated by religion, we also find strong evidence, and Christophe already alluded to this, that it is a highly caste segregated society. And caste remains a really potent social factor. And ironically, or perhaps strikingly, the vast majority of Indians did not say that there is widespread caste discrimination in India. Just about 20% said that caste discrimination is widespread in India. There is a lot of regional variation, though. In the South, 30% said that there is widespread caste discrimination. This is striking because the South is also known for its anti-caste movements. And in fact, one author, Ashutosh Varshney, has attributed the rapid economic growth of the South to the flattening of caste hierarchies. So how could it be that the Southerners see more caste discrimination than people elsewhere? Well, there's a couple factors. One, they could be referring to the rest of the country, that there's widespread caste discrimination elsewhere, but they could also be referring, it could also kind of point us in the direction that what people perceive to be discrimination is also contextual. It also depends on what they think is fair and acceptable in any society. And we do find in India, there's widespread acceptance of the fact that caste segregation is important. So people feel very against inter-caste marriages, just like they feel very against interreligious marriages. It's very important to stop inter-caste marriage. They keep their friendship circles confined to their particular caste, but they do not perceive this to be discrimination. So I think that's where we come to, like, what is the understanding of discrimination, and is segregation discrimination? And I think this also sheds some light to the question that Ravinder had raised earlier. So I encourage you, if you're interested in some of the findings on caste, take a look at chapter 4, goes into a lot of detail on caste, and then we also have some in the overview. Did I answer the question, Louise?
Sorry, rookie mistake.
One of these days we'll figure out how to unmute on Zoom and remember to do it.
By the time we're all back in the same room, I think probably. The other question which several people have posed in the chat, I'm just going to find some of those questions, is around the close identification of Hindi with being an Indian, and a desire, I think, to go a bit deeper into some of the regional variation on that question. I think it's Tejas, I'm just going back to my notes here, Tejas Parashar, who raises this question, that a number of the, so it's not somebody else, but a number of regional parties and regional movements, of course, have pivoted on linguistic nationalism at a sub-state level, and the close association with Tamil language, with the Dravidian identity, same in Karnataka, a Kannada identity. So do you see, what are the regional patterns in variation of association with Hindi and the kind of sense of national identity?
This is a great question.
And actually, as just an add-on to that, do you also ask a question about views on regional languages?
Okay, and if like speaking Tamil is very important to being truly Indian. Unfortunately, no, we couldn't quite ask that question. Although I would love to ask, the importance of Tamil language to people as their ethnicity, maybe sometime in the future. But let's talk about some of the regional variation. This is a very important topic because within Hindus, same religion, same country, huge gaps between opinions in the central part of the country, the northern part of the country, and in contrast with the south of the country. The south just really stands out. So Christophe already talked about this one, so I won't belabor it. Importance of the Hindi language. This is expected. Fewer people in the south say they speak Hindi, so of course they're less likely to say that speaking Hindi is very important to truly being Indian. Christophe, you said the number, I think it was like 27% saying, so thank you. Otherwise I would have to look it up, of people in the south saying speaking Hindi is very important. But when we look at sort of all three dimensions of how we talked about Hindu nationalism, you see the South standing out in all three of them. So what about the importance of being Hindu to national identity? Again, huge contrast. In the central part of the country, this figure is like in the 80s, but in the south it goes down, say in the 40s, right? And then BJP's vote share, like any way you look at it, you look at the survey, or you can take a look at the data from the national election that track pretty closely as far as the region breakout of the vote share is concerned. BJP got its lowest vote share in the south. So among Hindus, we find it at 19%. If you add up all three dimensions, which I did earlier to show that 30% of Hindus, kind of on all three dimensions, in the central part of the country, that figure rises to half or more. But in the south of the country, that's at 5%. So you can see this gulf. It's a gulf between the north and the south. And that gulf is in the context of some other differences between the north and the south. The south shows higher GDP, more economic prosperity. The other interesting finding, and I was just talking to Vignesh about this before we started the call, is evidence in this survey consistently that people in the south are giving less importance to religion. So they're less likely to say religion is very important in their life. They're less likely to pray on a daily basis. Ever which way you look at it, less importance to these factors in the South. One more dimension that I'll mention, and then we can go on to the next question, beef and Hindu identity. Beef and Hindu identity is another dimension. We ask people, can a person who eats beef still be a Hindu? There's again a gulf between the central part of the country and the south of the country. Southerners, they're kind of divided. 50% of them say, well, person who eats beef can't be a Hindu. The other 50% say that's fine. In the central part of the country, it's a vast majority of people saying that a person who eats beef cannot be a Hindu. Same religion, same country, huge differences in views of national identity and Hindu identity.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a slightly different question now, and I think I might initially address this to Hilal because you are sitting in CSDS and have been so closely associated with the Lognity surveys over time, but also because you spoke about the importance of historicizing this data and its interpretation. A number of you on the panel and a number of questioners have raised questions, I think, about change over time. So how significantly different are these findings today than if we had conducted if Pew had conducted a similar survey 10 years ago? And what there are kind of a number of hypotheses here, but about potential causal explanations for change in religiosity and religious attitudes. Ravinder gave us some very interesting, I think, and suggestive potential causal factors here with the growth of the middle class, the rise in education. Of course, the other big factor we've talked quite a bit about now is the rise of the BJP. Could you help to give us your sense of how this data compares with data from earlier Lognity surveys, and how you might respond to the kinds of questions, at least, we might ask about the potential causal explanations for what change we might have seen over time?
Yeah, thank you, Louise. First of all, about the comparative aspect of data, I think there are 3 or 4 things which can be compared here. We have been asking this question about does India belong to all, etc., since 2000s. So we have that comparative data, but we did one specific study in 2015, and that study devoted to the study of religion and secularism. What do people think of religion, religiosity, and the idea of secular, etc.? And many of the questions which are here we also ask. Unfortunately, we couldn't release the report, but I used that data in my own work. And then part of those questions we also ask in National Election Studies 2019. So there is a series of comparative, the possibility of comparison across time since 2000, and specifically in 2015 and 2019. It is very recent. Now, if we look at the present data, and that's why I initially said that I really like the report, is that it corresponds to the data which we collected. Like in 2019, we asked this question, does India belong to all religion? And 74%, 75% people said yes, India belongs to all. At the same time, we asked this question about emerging Hindu religiosity, and we get very similar sort of answers. So therefore, in terms of comparability, in terms of correlation between this data and the old data is possible, and it's here. So I don't think that it is one of sort of thing. We have comparative, the possibility of comparison is there. This is the technical part of the question which you asked. Now the substantial part of the question is, Christophe indicated a very interesting idea about the religiosity and its relationship with democracy. And I would like to actually develop that, because he indicated very sharply, and there is a need to develop that. Because, and I also underlined the limitation of survey method, remember, that we have to follow certain logic of asking questions. So you have to rely on the language, and you have to rely the way in which you delegate your questions to the people who are actually doing the survey. So therefore, the linguistic aspect of that is very crucial. Now, if that is the case, then the question of democracy, religiosity, and a strong leader, you may get very different kind of expression at the bottom level of society. So therefore, what Christophe is suggesting, and I completely agree with him, that we need to actually look at what is the meaning of democracy in India, in contemporary India. This survey, as I said initially, indicates a possibility to revisit some of the basic assumptions about democracy. And I must say that, again, it is a technical explanation. I must say that survey should not entirely be seen through the prism of majoritarianism. It's not majority opinion matters. We also have to look at what does a significant minority or even a 1.1% minority say. So if we keep that in mind, then the question of understanding democracy become very important, and we need systematic exploration of that. That's one. Second is the idea of a strong leader. Now, this idea of a strong leader in many respects does not contradict with the idea of democracy, in many respects. So if you look at our surveys and, their studies in Indian politics has got a very interesting issue in 2014 and 2019, or based on 2014 and 2019 elections, you may find that this figure of strong leader is somehow translated in the existing structure of politics. So therefore, when we say that it is a contrast between assertion for democracy and assertion for strong leader, I think this intermingling and overlapping need to be indicated. And this is precisely what I understood Christophe saying. So that is an area where the idea of religiosity is very crucial and important. Now, coming to the last point which I would like to make is about the practice of religion. I would say, when I was looking at the data, one thing which is very clear, and Christophe, again, you suggested that, but not as sharply as I was expecting. You refer to 1960 movement. What is the difference between 1960s and the present moment? Is the nature of competitive electoral politics has completely changed. At that point of time, the values of national movement were alive. People were articulating their political packages in the language of national movement, progress, caste, eradication of caste, eradication of communalism, etc. But at the moment, it's a different competitive politics where identities identities are purchased and sold. So in the competitive electoral politics, you have to sell your identity. So caste would become very important, and the success of BJP relies entirely on something called translating caste religion, the overlapping of caste and religion, and that produced remarkable result for them. Interestingly, no political actor is showing any interest in providing a positive package to religion, caste, and what Christophe says, reform. So there is conservatism in India, and this conservatism is somehow translated in a democratic framework and making democracy is just a market of election. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilal. I'm going to do my best to pull out another theme, which is emerging from the questions, which builds, I think, on where Hilal has left us, which is the implications of the findings on segregation for thinking about Indian secularism. And I'm actually going to read out a couple of questions because you've put it better than I might. So from Yusra Khan, can communal harmony coexist with respectful segregation? How do we develop a more nuanced understanding of Indian secularism then, as seen through this lens of segregated plurality? Is this nuance even valid, or does it all just dissolve into bigotry? And a slightly related question, I think, from Balvir Aurora, who notes that Christophe raised the question of whether living separately is actually less to do with religion and more to do with caste. And if that's the case, how does that feed into the way we think about the findings of this survey and the resilience of secularism? I think there were another couple of questions from Rohan Kalyan, who asked, given apparently high levels of respect and tolerance for other religions, but also this desire to keep religious communities separate, is this an indication of the success of the Nehruvian idea of secularism and of religious pluralism, or is it really a reflection of its failure to take root in Indian society? So I think I might pose those to Christophe first, if that's all right.
Thank you. That's quite challenging, in fact, but great questions without any doubt. Well, to live separately may not be such a big problem, and when we did our book on Muslims in Indian cities 10 years ago, we realized that for many Muslims to live separately was somewhat a relief, to be between themselves, for safety in particular, but also for cultural homogeneity and cohesion, was a choice. Except that after centuries of some mixing together, in many places, many cities, Muslims and others are living together, somewhat cohabiting. And the transition from this cohabitation to separation is bound to be painful. It's a transition that has already started. We see ghettoization taking place in many big cities, and it has never been an easy process. And interestingly, it's a process we see in cities. Of course, Ahmedabad is a laboratory, but we see it also in rural areas, and the Muzaffarnagar district riots in 2013 have resulted in some ghettoization in rural parts of the country as well. So it's not as if this could be a solution. It may be a solution, but it may not be an easy solution. The other question that is asked by Balvir on the way this living separately kind of pattern echoes the caste system, the way caste is structuring social life, generally speaking. Well, it's interesting to see that in many ways, we tend to look at these silos as on the same footing, whereas the caste system is hierarchical. And it's not as if everybody would have some space somewhere. Those who are at the bottom of the pyramid will not have access to the good space. And therefore, it's not a solution either, in the sense that who will be relegated at the periphery of the cities, just to take this example. And here you see something that those who do fieldwork know very well. Muslim bastis and Dalit bastis are very often very close, next to each other. And nobody likes it. And this competition is bound to remain. And if Muslims are becoming the new untouchables of the Indian society, we can see that the caste system model is not an easy one either. So this kind of survey forces us, because we have data, it's not ethnographic, it's not caste-based studies, it's not microscopic, it's the larger picture. So it forces us to think ahead, how do we get out of it? How do we make a society living together? And the solutions that we see emerging, or what appears to be a solution, to live separately, that's not so easy. To live separately is not an easy thing. And many societies have tried. I mentioned Israel, you can look at South Africa. It has never been an easy thing to do. So I'm really grateful for this. The survey forces everybody to look at the situation and think ahead. And secularism is a very old word, there is a fatigue with it, but there is no alternative, probably. It has to be reinvented, yes, but how do you get out of it? I mean, by what do you replace it? That's for the thinkers and the think tanks of the country to make the suggestions.
Thank you very much, Christophe. I'm going to ask a final question, which we haven't addressed yet, and it's relates to gender, which Mira M raises in the Q&A, and I'll address this jointly to Ravinder and to Neha, because you may want to tag team to present some of the data and to interpret it. But could you tell us a bit about the findings when viewed through a gender lens? So how much of a distinction do you see in male and female attitudes to religion and tolerance and segregation and intermarriage and so on? And Ravinder, it'd be particularly interesting to reflect on the very interesting observation that you started with earlier about intergenerational differences and respect for elders, and also how these play out along gender lines. I think you left us with a very interesting puzzle about the rather divergent trends that might be at play here, between, on the one hand, a very enduring respect for elders, and on the other, increasing spaces for freedom and exploration that open up as a result of greater access to college education, especially for women. I don't really mind who goes first, but Neha, would you like to just give us an overview of the data on gender, and then I could turn to Ravinder? Yeah,
I would love to hear Ravinder's opinion on this, so I'll keep my remarks pretty short. But I mean, we don't see a lot of variation by gender. Women being just as opposed to interreligious marriage, on other factors. I mean, we know, around the world, women are slightly more religious than men. That comes through, but that's not a huge surprise. But on other social political attitudes, we don't see women taking a very different position on these issues. So I'm going to stop there and let Ravinder have most of the time.
Thanks. So over to you, Ravinder.
Actually, there's a lot about gender in the report, but not in this report, but in the larger survey. And I think Neha and all will be bringing that out separately. So I was kind of, setting aside time because the findings are very interesting in that report. On the religion bit, what I mostly noticed was that on average, women tend to have more conservative opinions vis-a-vis religious matters, which kind of surprised me because ethnographically, women are often more tolerant when it comes to interreligious marriage of their children, or persuading the father that this is okay if everything else, class and other things match, etc. So I was a bit surprised, but then for a long time, political scientists and others have said that women are the repository of, and the home is the repository of transmission of religion and culture, etc. So, so I would, not, I mean, I could say that, maybe that accounts for the fact, or maybe people just go by, they tend to practice religion more, especially in the home. In the case of Muslims, we found that, there was not many women, of course, go to the mosque, but they have different forms of prayer at home. So you find that they have a very important role. It might not be a public role. Although more recently, we have had the Shiv Sena and the RSS putting more women on the forefront, and they can be quite violent and virulent or whatever. But on the other hand, I think the kind of religiosity that women practice is sort of different. It's not so political and not so militant in certain ways, and this goes across religion. And this transmission, it's a kind of the point I made about respect for elders. And so kinds of transmissions that take place within the family and the household of religion are both to do with civic as well as to do with purely religious. To Christophe, I wanted to say that, look, I don't need to believe in God to be a Sikh. I mean, it's a cultural inheritance in some ways. I hardly ever practice Sikhism, but I do very much feel I'm a Sikh. So if Hindus say that, they don't need to believe in God to be Hindus, that's true of, many of us around here. But the point, I don't want to talk, in the gender aspect, I remember that son preference comes out very strongly. And I would say that somewhere that is associated again with Hindu religion, but then we see that it's percolated as much into the Muslim community, that son preference is becoming more important as fertility rates decline and people have to choose the gender of their children. So in our earlier studies, we always talked about how son preference was related to ancestor worship, to religious fact of, being able to, continue the lineage, etc., etc. But I think that's a different conversation. Maybe we need to have it another time. But I do, just start talking about gender, but going back to what Hilal also said, the resistance from the margins. And I see that resistance happening in the younger generations on a daily basis. Its success might take a long time, but there is a lot of pushback, to the kinds of things that Christophe has highlighted. And it's true that those things are right there for us and they're visible. But and I myself have pointed to and written about the precarity of Muslims currently. But on the other hand, a lot of what the report says is true about nationalism and, Muslims also feeling their national identity very closely. And I read a short article in the EPW, which talks about online Muslim youth. So I think we need to put these things together somewhere. We need to put, even if it's a survey, do we have the right to reject? If the survey says that there is a tolerance of a certain type, there is a respect of a certain sort, that there is there for all religions. In my mind, people who are religious, who believe in piety or whatever, they will feel, they rarely are against other religions. I think here I would separate people from leaders and politicians, etc. And, if you want to talk about syncretism, the syncretism survives in rural areas. It survives in local religiosity. which not many people, I mean, even sociologists have stopped studying it. At one time, you know, great tradition, little tradition, all kinds of things. My own fieldwork in Punjab, no Muslims had left the village, but dargahs were alive and people were going there. So I think some of that does not, of course, get captured in surveys. The rural everyday life and everyday dependencies, the economic dependencies, people may live differently, but even our study of Ayodhya, not mine, but other people's, has shown that the Muslims are the one who makes all the materials for prayer in Hindu temples. So there are certain kinds of interdependencies that may not be, there may be residential segregation, but on the other hand, you don't see it in the markets. You don't see it in, where people are maybe forced to interact in terms of their economic roles and dependencies. The tanneries we know are owned by Hindus and run by Muslims. So I mean, I think the Indian picture is always far more complex, and it's a religiously, culturally complex society. And yes, maybe what we see in the South today is a reduction in the importance of religion as such, but religion itself can take different forms, different shapes. I think the meaning of religion today is also shifting somewhat, meaning of faith, how people experience religion is shifting. Somehow what didn't get captured in the survey is, people like Amritan and Mai, and a lot of these gurus, like a lot of people said that they didn't actually follow or didn't have family gurus, etc. Maybe somewhere we didn't do a good job in asking that question. Anyway, I mean, I think, Neha, I hope you'll have a separate session for gender, because that deserves its
Yeah,
own.
no, thanks for that teaser. I mean, we did cover gender in this survey, but we felt the findings would get lost. So we're leaving that aside, maybe for a separate report. I'll bring back, the points about gender you made earlier about women having socially conservative attitudes. That's actually, we see that around the world. I mean, just to add, because since we do surveys in the US as well, the issue of abortion, in the United States, women's attitudes to whether abortion should be legal or not are the same as that of men. We just don't see women, and that part of that is women are more religious. So, and the two are highly correlated with each other. Even we've done work in the Middle East, and there we ask the question, a wife is obligated to obey her husband. And women had the same attitude on that question as men. So this is not just an Indian thing. This is a worldwide thing. You just don't see women taking we do see women taking socially conservative positions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I think we will all look forward to the second instalment on gender, because there's clearly a lot more to explore there. But for now, I'm going to bring today's panel to a close. So a very sincere thanks to Neha, to Christophe, to Hilal, and to Ravinder for really opening out the survey. I think, as Hilal started by saying, raising more questions than offering answers, but that is the best tradition of a survey discussion. So thank you all very much. We will release this recording after today's event, so you'll be able to listen back. The survey report is now published on the Pew website, so you can go and delve into that much more deeply. But for today, thank you very much for attending.